The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
And hi, everybody. I'm here with my colleague Alan Kurtz, and we're both going to take part in presenting this family-centered transition planning session to you. And basically what we've done, just to introduce it, is over the last few years, and based on some other previous transition research that we did, we put together a service that called Family-Centered Transition Planning. And at first we tried it out in Maine and New Hampshire with grant funding. And we're going to tell you some of the outcomes of that. And then in the next phase, we are instituting it as a permanent service offering in Maine and New Hampshire, and then also allying with some other states to implement the service. So we want to tell you about it, and then we'll leave plenty of time for your questions. And so I'm going to go to my next slide and turn it over to Alan.
Okay, thanks, David. I wanted to ask a question of those of the attendees first, and that is, have you noticed or have you found anything associated with good or positive transition outcomes for people with autism spectrum disorders who you know?
Yeah, let me read you. There are a couple here. Okay, so good support systems, inclusion of the student, structure and communication, hard work, parents becoming informed, communicating, letting the child know what is happening before it happens, choices for individuals, family involvement and family direction, social support, preparing and planning. So those were the responses.
Okay, thank you. Let's look at what some of the research indicates is related to good transition outcomes. First is active student involvement, and I think some of you got to that. When students are more actively involved in their own planning, they tend to have better results. That's both true of post-secondary education and employment. Active parent participation in the planning process. Work experience, and that's one of the strongest predictors of adult outcomes, is work experience in high school. And that's one of the few places where I think if you can correct me if I'm wrong, David, where the research is really strong about the importance of work experience while a person is in high school.
Yes, I've never seen anything to contradict that.
Interagency collaboration. The development of self-determination skills. There's a lot of literature out there now on self-determination, on how important that is.
Okay, so those are our 5.
Okay, so we developed this project. It was David's idea. He got in touch with me. We decided to do it in 2 states, New Hampshire and Maine. In the first year, we recruited students who were between the ages of 16 and 18 who had a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder. We recruited them through transition coordinators, special educators, and they provide the information to families, and the families contacted us directly, and we enrolled them in the project if they were interested, and after we provided them some information. We randomly assigned the participants to 2 groups. One got the intervention in the first year. The other group got the intervention in the second year. And both the student and at least one parent were enrolled in the project. And we did this, we did it over 2 years with the delayed control group so that we could see if there was an effect of this intervention that we were testing, this family-centered transition intervention. We collected a number of data prior to the first year. We had 2 surveys about expectations for the future, one for students and one for their family members. We used the ARC self-determination inventory, and we had a measure of career awareness called the vocational decision-making inventory. We also looked at IEP plans. We did some open-ended family interviews, and then after 1 year, we did some follow-up interviews and the surveys. That way, we could see if there was a change from the beginning of year 1 to the end of the year, after half the students who were involved in it had participated in it for a year. The project design, we had 3 components to it. When I talked about the intervention, it was this comprehensive intervention. The first was parent training, and the parents went to a training on 3 Saturdays. We had a New Hampshire training, and we had a Maine training. And the training was, originally developed in New Hampshire, but the people who did the training, Patty Cotton, Leslie Bogus, customized it to make sure that it fit in Maine, because services are slightly different in Maine than they are in New Hampshire. The parents learned a lot about the kind of services that are available. They learned a lot about taking control of the planning process. They learned about creative financing, person-centered planning strategies. Am I leaving anything out, David?
No, yeah, no. In effect, it was kind of the didactic part, and also parents got to know one another, and it was nice having parents in a pretty, in that pretty stressful period of transition, realize that they're, they're in the same boat as other parents, and so there was some of that networking. And then as the other components rolled out, they basically became the individualized working out of what people learned during the parent training.
We have an acronym up there that I didn't define, SPECS, and that's the name of the training that was developed in New Hampshire. It stands for Specific Planning Encourages Creative Solutions. And I think that was really the strength of it. It really helped a lot of families think outside the box, to really think creatively about what could happen for their children. The second component, David referred to this already, was the person-centered planning. We had 5 to 9 meetings that extended over 6 to 9 months sometimes. And we invited, they usually started small, might be just a few family members and the person, but over time, we encouraged the families to invite more people, to engage more people in the process. And this was really a fun part of the project, and David will be talking a little bit more about that later, what those planning meetings look like. But it was nice to be able to do it over such a long period of time, where we would come up with some ideas and we could go out and try things, and then we would come back and we could talk as a group about how things are going and make some changes and try new things. And the final part, and this was really tied with the person-centered planning, is career exploration. We work with people to identify opportunities and to support them to go out and try different types of jobs, to gain some work experience. In some cases it was volunteering. It was really a pretty wide variety of things, but it was always tied to the person-centered planning. And what we did in those career exploration activities really grew out of that, the person-centered planning process.
Right. Okay.
Okay, these are our results.
But we wanted to make sure we could validate that what we were doing as what's called an evidence-based practice through, legitimate research methods. So it's people who kind of don't value that as much, I guess, won't care. But there are people who really want to see, what's the proof, especially as we go asking people to pay for this. What's the proof that it works? So with these 4 surveys: student expectations, parent expectations, self-determination, and vocational decision-making. We had we basically the group that got the service went up much higher than the control group. And so that these p-values, 0.01, 0.02, 0.00, 0.01, means the probability that those things were just due to chance is very, very, very low. They were most likely due to our service, our intervention. The control group improved a little bit, but nowhere near as well as the FCTP group, because people do mature a little bit as they get older anyway, and people do get some transition services through their schools that would help them improve in some of these areas a little bit anyway, but nowhere near as much as our control, our treatment, what's called the treatment group or the service group. So I'll turn it over to this for this one, Alan.
We looked at, we used something called the Statement of Transition Services Review Protocol to look at the IEPs. And it's a fairly extensive document. You can go through to look at the transition component of IEPs. We looked at things like who was on the team, what's their systematic data collection, were they working towards a diploma. We looked at the quality of goals in a lot of different areas, including employment, post-secondary ed, independent living, recreation, and leisure. I think the total possible points you could get was over 200. And what we found was, you can see the results here. The rating for the intervention group started at 30.35, which doesn't really mean a lot if you can't see the actual instrument, but you have to trust me, it's really low. And there was some improvement from pre to post for the FCTP group, and it was just significant. There was some small improvement for the control group as well. That wasn't significant. So basically, we found that we didn't have as powerful effect on the quality of the school's IEP, transition IEPs as we had hoped.
And we kind of conclude that, despite what we've done, they stayed basically not very good. They got a little better, but they still were not very good.
Yeah.
And that's that finding has kind of held. So we have just a couple points. At a couple points, we have a picture of some of our participants that have given us releases, and we just wanted to show some things people do, and also perhaps some things that that might seem non-traditional. Some people might think there's some danger in making flambe. But this man got to be a good cook. His parents, when we interviewed his parents, she said something. Her mother said something like, when he helps with dinner now, when he chops up vegetables, they're all exactly the same size. So he got really good.
Could I add something about him, David?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got him involved in an internship, and when we first started talking about it, we asked him, where would he like to work? And he's someone that has fairly limited speech, although he is obsessed with cooking, and he does read cookbooks all the time as one of his hobbies. But we asked him where he wanted to eat, where he wanted to work, and he said Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King, McDonald's, sort of the standards. But as a team, when we explored it, we thought, well, maybe he could work at this local college, which has one of the top food services programs, or the food services for a small college in the country. And we talked about who we knew who worked there, who we might ask about it. And eventually we got him an internship at that college, which we think was a lot more valuable to him than working at Burger King.
Yep, great. And so we wanted to show you not the person shown in the picture, but just a different person, and just give you an example of what this person-centered planning is like and how we kind of did these things. So I was just going to show you with this gentleman, Matt, a young man that was in his last year of school, and just show you how some of these things work. A lot of it is done with the group. A group gets together in the person's house, and so generally it might start small. It might be Matt, his mother, and a facilitator from our project. But what we try to do is then reach out and grab kind of more of Matt's network and get more people involved in the transition planning than people originally thought was going to be possible. And so one of the ways that the group works is by having the flip chart paper at the front, and then the facilitator, uses a lot of time uses pictures and images because not everybody is a good reader, and so we call these things maps. This would be what we would call a relationships map, and simply draw pictures of the people in Matt's life, and these would become the people that could be possible sources of support, ideas, resources, and so on. This is somewhat similar. This is extending invitations to people to be more involved in the planning, and so this would be the group brainstorming. Who else could be involved? What could we ask of people? A lot of times there's a real reluctance to sort of burden, in a sense, your neighbor, or I don't know, somebody that you know through your church or something like that to be involved in the planning. But once people do it and see that people do not feel burdened, people do, obviously people have their time is valuable. But if you ask some people to do something small, it's amazing how many people we could wind up getting involved in a person's planning, and in a really valuable way, because they come to see a person in just different sides of a person than the immediate family. But just to continue for just a little while on Matt's, to show you the process. Once the group was together, a big part of it is to make again, these things are called maps, and these are called preferences maps. And so we try to map out what works and what doesn't work. So this was on your left-hand side. You have what works and what doesn't work as far as learning, and then what works and doesn't work on the right-hand side, just in general in Matt's life. And the specifics aren't as so important. Obviously, he loves his Mac laptop, for example. That was one thing that works for him. He doesn't like downtime. He tends to get bombarded by thoughts and worries if he isn't kind of kept busy with something to do. And so everyone, basically, as you can sort of imagine this going, is that everyone in the room contributes. Things are kind of run by Matt, as far as him, like, does that seem right to you, Matt, before we put it up there? And then it becomes this kind of group brainstorming of that we would use to say, okay, well, obviously what we want for him when he graduates is to be in situations where he has a lot of what works and as little as possible of what doesn't work for him. So this becomes a really important planning tool. And then a couple more things. I guess I should mention the reason why we have these slides is because we've gotten in the habit nowadays with modern technology. The simplest way to keep everyone involved is to take little photographs with your smartphone of the flip charts. So the facilitator will just basically take a snapshot of the flip charts before flipping over to a new page, and then at the end just email the 7 or 8 or whatever it is flip charts to everybody, and those can be emailed to someone else who couldn't attend or whatever, so that person could kind of stay involved too. So this flip chart here was Matt's trying to set his goals, and this was some of his recreation goals, some of his health goals. You get some in the upper left here, some of his work goals. In the upper right, some of his home and living goals. Where would you like to live? I said we'd like to live with a friend. And then what does he need to learn? He would need to learn how to shop for groceries, his health. He had some issues with weight, and he wanted to go to yoga class, go to a gym. His work interests kind of related to art and anime, and so he thought, well, maybe he could teach art, maybe he could do computer animation or something like that. And obviously, these are teenage sort of fantasy occupations at first, and that's perfectly fine, because as you start out exploring them and having some experiences, you know, they kind of intersect with reality at some point and become real, you know, post-school activities that people can do. Here's something that what happened with Matt is that through exploration, we found out that there was this Institute of Art in not too far from within reasonable distance of his home in New Hampshire. And he applied, and he was actually accepted there to a 2-week pre-college summer program. So it's kind of a high school to college transition program it was art related. It was, you know, it's a private institute, so there was a $2,000 tuition. And he would live on a dorm, and it would be nice. He would be able to test out, you know, being away from home, test out, you know, whether he'd be able to, you know, wake up on time with his alarm clock and get dressed. Because as long as, you know, you're there with mom and dad, you know, it's hard to break that dependency just because the support is so available, and people have been doing it all a person's life. So he was accepted. $2,000 was a lot of money, but he got a $500 scholarship. And then his parents, you know, could put some towards it, and then they went to the school, and then they asked the school, and this is where that comes in. We, you know, once we do the person-centered planning, then you can go and make requests of places, and so he would the parents would ask the school, can you put any money towards this tuition? And they said, well, we normally have this such and such a summer program for, you know, special ed kids. And they go, well, that doesn't work. That's not what Matt wants. He wants to go to this art school. How much money would you spend sending him to your special ed summer program? And they would maybe, you know, quote a figure, $800 or whatever. And they would say, well, can we have the $800 towards the $2,000 tuition? And, you know, some schools react very poorly to this kind of request. But in Matt's case, the school didn't react poorly. The school wanted him to have a good transition, and they had the money they were going to put towards the traditional program that they would be glad to add. So they pieced together the 3 pieces: the scholarship, some money the school gave, some money the parents gave, and Matt had a really positive 2-week period, and made him feel like he could apply and go to college for art. Whether he will, let me go back to here. Whether he will actually wind up having a job in the art field, I mean, and who knows? Or will he ever really be an art teacher, or will he ever really do anime? That's hard to know. But he went, for example, to an anime convention, and with his, I believe, accompanied by his older sister, and he had a great time at the convention. You know, he wound up, you know, growing as a person from that experience away from home, as well as learning some stuff about the anime profession that may or may not come in handy. And through these different experiences is what allows people to wind up having higher expectations for the future, higher career maturity, and more self-determination, and so on. So, and one thing, I don't know if you've had this thought already, but once you start getting people involved in person-centered planning, so that it's a group of people all focused on problem solving and putting ideas up on flip chart paper, the issue comes in that some people on the autism spectrum, really their forte isn't, you know, talking in groups, and you know, and people might have social anxiety and things like that. So I think this is, if you're there, Alan, I'll turn it over to you to talk about what we kind of found about how you tweak the person-centered planning process to make sure that the people on the spectrum could benefit.
Sure. I think one of the nice things about person-centered planning the way we did it was that we had independent facilitators. They weren't tied to the school or to adult services. You know, they really didn't have any stake in the outcomes. They were there just independently to facilitate the process for the families. One of the problems with that, though, I think it's especially problematic for people on the autism spectrum, is sometimes they're not comfortable with having a stranger facilitate meetings. So in a lot of cases, the facilitators who worked on the project had to get to know the person first before the planning process started. One example was a student who liked Disney cartoons, and he wanted to go to a bookstore. So the facilitator and he went to a bookstore to find a book about Disney cartoons. Another person who was really didn't like being in groups, didn't like meetings, was able to attend from his bedroom by using Skype, and that worked out really well for him. And there were a number of different distance attendance strategies that we used. We did a lot of individualized preparation, meeting with people prior to the meetings to talk about the agenda and plan participation. We have 2 people working on the project in the first 2 years, one from New Hampshire and one from Maine, who were on the autism spectrum themselves. And they had some really good ideas in helping people to prepare, and were involved in helping people prepare. The facilitators, they just sort of came up with these ideas on their own. I wish we could say that we had planned all these things, but they did what was needed to make the process work. And one of those things was flexible meeting designs. So some people needed opportunities for breaks. They might participate for a short period of time, and you might decide on that ahead of time. You might come in and make a presentation. One person with a facilitator who was on the spectrum herself put together a PowerPoint presentation, and he asked her to deliver that for him, attending only for 10 to 15 minutes at the beginning or for a question and answer session, and avoiding certain trigger words. And this was really difficult. I mean, there were people who said, well, I'll do this, but you can't use the word planning, or you can't use the word independence, or in one case, you can't use the word transition. So that made it a little bit difficult, but I think the teams did a really nice job in avoiding those trigger words.
Let me see. Okay.
Student participation, checking in with a person using augmentative alternative communication to make sure that they have time to communicate. Because I think often people using AAC get left out of the process because they get left behind and they can't keep up with the conversation or the dialogue. For one person whose speech was hard to understand, there were lots of check-ins with him, and he would give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to make sure that his message had been conveyed correctly. And another person who just commented through Post-it notes. He had the paraprofessional who worked with him in school sitting next to him to help him with that. He preferred writing to speaking, and he would write on the Post-it notes. The paraprofessional would say, okay, he has something to say, and he would take the note up, put it on the chart paper, and read what he had written. We did some family interviews, and this was really interesting. The quantitative data that we got, I thought, showed that it was useful. We learned a lot from these family interviews, though, as well. Most families thought it was useful and important, kept them on track. It parceled out tasks into discrete tasks. So sometimes when you think about transition, I think families, and especially, they think about all these things that have to be done to prepare the student for living independently, for working, for going on to post-secondary education. It can seem overwhelming. When you break that into small tasks, it can really help. They talked about how the facilitators modeled tenacity and how they, really helped people, supported people as they worked towards goals, and it helped connect families to other supportive people, including other people who were involved in the project, other families. It was growth enhancing for students, and we heard this quite a bit about how there was some discomfort, especially for the students with some things where we were pushing them a little bit beyond their comfort zone. As one person said, nobody grows up without a little bit of tension. And everybody felt that it was a positive experience, although there was some anxiety at first when I think families began to realize that we were going to push people a little bit beyond that comfort zone. And people learned to advocate for themselves and take a much more active role in their own planning. A lot of families became much more aware of their child's strength and their potential. We had 2 people, I think, who drove to the prom, and which was just unimaginable to some of the families before this process started. People got meaningful jobs. People took college classes. I think overall, people really began to think much more positively about what was possible for their children. They learned to think outside the box, especially in accessing resources. And they began to think about using friends and relatives, other community members, clubs and teams, iPads, to help their child and themselves achieve their goals. And using formal resources in non-traditional ways. And this was something that was really emphasized in the SPECS training. One example of that was asking a high school to provide transportation to a community college, and they agreed to do that. We found that experiences with adult services was mixed, and some people were very disappointed with adult services.
Let's see, I guess that's...
This is a young man who was involved in the first year of our project. He told us that he was interested in oceanography, and Janet, one of the facilitators, got him an internship testing red tide on the coast of Maine. He really enjoyed this. He got very excited about it, went to a community college, and he's actually a student here at the University of Maine now studying biochemistry. And he is a guest lecturer in 2 transition projects that we have right now.
So, and because there was so much interest in people knowing, well, not just what people put on surveys, but what actually did happen to this group. We went 1 year after the project was over. We went and found as many people as we could. Some people had moved out of state and so on, but we found 25 of the original people. And so this is what we asked them what they were doing and what they had been doing since they graduated. And so as you can see here, over 2/3 had a paid job, and almost all the others were working in some sort of volunteer or unpaid capacity. Only 4% had not really worked at all. Average wage, $9.06 an hour, was well over minimum wage at least, and 14.1 hours a week. As far as participation in post-secondary education, it's about a little bit less than half. But there we had a lot of people go to two-year colleges, community colleges, with some going to 4-year colleges in New Hampshire and Maine, and a couple going to sort of some other specialized post-secondary programs. So we kind of felt these were much higher outcomes than we had seen in the published literature and that most people experience with transition with this group. So our work these days is in the problem that always happens with the grant is that eventually the grant's over and people say, well, thank you, wasn't that nice? But you can't really sustain a permanent service with grant funding. That's not what the grant is for. And so we are in a process now of trying to turn this over into local organizations in New Hampshire and Maine, and in a third state, and then and that's going very well. So giving our ideas, the curricula we have, the process for facilitation and all those things to a local organization in New Hampshire and a local organization in Maine. And then the other part of that is getting the regular funders to pay for it. I always tell people that you're basically already paying for transition. You're just paying for the wrong thing. Could you just put the money you're already spending on transition towards family-centered transition planning? And so we've been meeting with individual school districts, with the vocational rehabilitation, because almost everyone who has a vocational goal would qualify for vocational rehabilitation, and then a smaller kind of cohort qualifies for Maine or New Hampshire developmental services as having a developmental disability. There's people with more higher functioning autism that don't qualify. So in that case, we just have the 2 funders. There certainly are other possibilities for funding sources, but those are the main ones. And so we've came up with a price, and it varies significantly depending on what exactly is built into the service, but somewhere in the realm of $3,600 or possibly a little bit more, $3,800, to do family-centered transition planning and basically jumpstart somebody into a positive future. And so if we were going to the school, what we're doing now is asking them to pay 1/3, $1,200. In voc rehab, would you pay $1,200? And we're just sort of working on that slowly. It's really like pulling teeth to get people to spend money. But as people see the outcomes, they refer people that they don't know how to achieve these outcomes with to the project, and it's sort of growing slowly. And we're hoping that within we have about another year and a half in order to achieve kind of full implementation before Alan and I will kind of, at least our current roles will be ended, and we're hoping that this actually will stick. And our 3rd state that we picked after a whole process of trying to see who was interested in this, and we certainly would be welcome, if any of you listening to the webinar kind of want to think about this in your own communities. But the one we have gone with right now is Los Angeles, California. So there's a service organization called the J. Nolan Center in Los Angeles. It's actually, I think, in Burbank. And so our staff flies in and out of the Bob Hope Airport in Burbank, California, and has been teaching them to do this strategy, and they're translating some of the specs materials into Spanish and implementing it with a really different service design than New Hampshire and Maine have. And so let me see what this is just what we're kind of asking, what our basic idea is. While we are still around, we'll provide the program model, we'll provide the staff training. We have all the tools people need. We have all the the maps, formats, and all that stuff, and we provide technical assistance and mentoring. And we want the community, though, to have some sort of host agency that's willing to do this. And like with anything, it's not a gigantic profit margin. It's basically something you would do because you really believe in it, and then with contacts and a reputation, so that they can actually create contracts with funders. That's pretty much what how we are going to conclude and what we're up to these days. We think that family-centered transition planning is a good model and has proven to work. We've had publications accepted in peer-reviewed journals that is evidence-based practice, and we're in a process now of doing things like this webinar to kind of promote it and see if we can spread the idea. And so I think at this point it's about 1:45, and we are happy and hope there's questions. Hey, can I explain why there's a bee on the sunflower? This sunflower picture was taken by somebody in our project who was interested in photography as a career, and one of the nice one of the things people sometimes consider as a weakness of people with autism is their attention to detail, kind of almost like a single-minded. And this man waited until a bee landed on the sunflower and then got that amazing picture. that I think if he hadn't had been on the autism spectrum, we would never see that.
Okay, so questions. So first, I've got a question here. How do I get my son to understand the importance of focusing on his transition? I can't get him engaged because he doesn't want to grow up.
Yeah, that's that tension idea. So, you know, feel free, Alan, to join in. You know, we'll both answer these. I think there is that tension idea. People basically, you know, we talk to him about things that, what are you going to do after high school, and try to go a little bit to the child's level. One of the problems with some traditional transition is that they start talking with you know, 18 and 19 and 20-year-old people about too many grown-up topics, like, well, so what kind of career do you want? And you know, nobody 19 knows what career they want. So we kind of start small. We start with the idea of really taking seriously, this guy wants to learn more about anime. Because a teenager, as a teenager, that's something he would be willing to explore. We don't have to go all the way to growing up, you know, right away. And then as people wind up talking, it is a little tiny bit stressful, and it's managed just very slowly that people wind up talking about, well, you know, at a certain date, you know, the school bus doesn't show up anymore, and well, let's just plan for that day.
I think when I talked earlier about the trigger words, I think those people had the same sort of issues. They didn't want to talk about transition. It wasn't just the word, you know, there was some anxiety about the whole process. I think as David said, you know, really talking to people where they're at is important. And one of the best examples I can think of is a kid who really wasn't that excited about meeting. And one of the facilitators asked him, well, what do you like to do? And he said, I like to break things. And the parent sort of wanted to discourage that discussion, but there were two facilitators there, and they both said, well, no, let's hear more about that. And they said, can you think of anything where you could get a job breaking things? And he said, no. But then he hadn't been participating in the meeting at all. He started pointing to each person in the room and asked them, can you think of something? Can you think of a job where I could break things? And that was really what got him much more involved in the process.
Okay, great. Here's another really good question. This is from a family member. It says, my nephew has Asperger's syndrome, but his parents are in denial. He is 19 and is struggling now and having a hard time finding strategies to get out of responsibility. Oh, I think they meant he's using creative strategies to get out of responsibility. He's gone so far as to fake illness, injury, etc. How can I help? I want to step in but don't know how.
You have thoughts, Alan?
Yeah, I'm not sure there are any quick answers to that. I mean, I think it's something that, you know, would have to be addressed over a long period of time. I don't know. I mean, you can suggest that, you know, that you have a series of person-centered planning meetings and then find someone who's skilled at facilitating them.
Yeah.
You, David?
No, I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, we'd have to kind of know one of the things that's absolutely imperative is to get to know the person a little bit and what is the issue there. You know, we start very, very small. At first, it's, you know, can I come over to your house and talk to you and your mom about what you like? And, you know, people. So we're not saying, you know, so, you know, if that is too stressful, well, okay, well then, what would be a tiny step that we can take towards this that isn't too stressful for the person? And there usually is some hook, you know, something the person is interested in or fascinated with or likes to talk about. You know, we talked about the business about the person who just wanted to talk about Disney cartoons. They didn't want to talk about growing up. They just wanted to talk about this. So, okay, we'll go to the bookstore and we'll look at books about Disney and start there. So so there's a certain interpersonal skill of being kind of a transition specialist.
Okay, got it. Okay, here's another good one. Do you have any tips on helping to profile people who would be likely to want to help us with this? I mean, family members, community members. What would I be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, you know, personal connections is sort of what you look for. Um, a lot of times a person will know who is nice to them, who smiles at them, who they like, whether they like, they like the bus driver, or like the teacher aide, or like the gym coach, or at school, or whether they're close to the neighbors and that kind of thing. So connections like that, where between the child and someone in the community are good, and then connections of the family. A lot of times we found, although it's not ideal, I don't necessarily want my future to be planned by like my parents' friends, but a lot of times that is actually who would wind up getting involved. Like the parents would invite another couple or another family that they were friendly with from some other context, and they would basically get to know the young person, and then contribute whatever ideas they could. There's a huge advantage in just having, taking the heat off of just this one person, which is usually mom, has to have this whole burden, and sort of spread it among more people.
And you look for people who have a shared interest. We had a lot of people, I don't know whether this is representative of people on the autism spectrum these days in general, but a lot of people were interested in graphic arts. And one person in the project, we connected with somebody who worked at a business, a local business where they did graphic arts, and they connected him with them. And he went on to college, but he's remained friends with them since then. It was a really good experience for him, too.
Okay, great. How do you handle a person with autism who wants to do things that they are not qualified to do? You don't want to throw cold water on their initiative, yet what they want to do is not realistic given their abilities.
Well, we all start out at a fantasy level. We want to be an Indian chief or an astronaut or something like that, a ballerina, pitch for the Mets or something, and and so that's fine. That's where you start. And but what you do with that energy is start the exploration process. Somebody says, I want to be an astronaut. Okay, well, let's look into that. Where do astronauts? What are astronauts' backgrounds? Where would you go to college? One thing that you can do if you want to be an astronaut is apply to go to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama for a summer. So fill out the application. If something is unrealistic, it will work out. But that's really not, certainly me, as my field is career counseling, and I would never say that I know whether or not, for sure, whether or not you can or can't be an astronaut. It's not up to me to say that. The people at space camp, if they want to accept you, well, then you'll go. If they don't accept you, you'll cry, and then we'll talk about it. Same thing with a lot of astronauts go to the Air Force Academy and then become pilots. So apply to the Air Force Academy. We'll help you apply, or at least look into, well, what do you have to have? What kind of high school courses do you have to have a chance of applying to the, and then you look into it. A lot of times as people look into it, they'll say, whoa, I don't want to do all that work. I don't want to take all those science courses. And as they get a more realistic idea, then their ideas and their interests change. And as people explore, there's a term called supported failure. As people explore something unrealistic, it won't work out, and then you'll be there with them to see them through the whole process of letting that go and then picking something else that's a compromise. I mean, I don't know how many of us, if we took a poll, are doing what we said we were going to do when we grew up, when we were adolescents, but I would kind of think it's close to zero. And does that mean that we're all running around like sad? Of course not. We explored it, and then we came to a more realistic realization on our own eventually.
Okay, great. Here's a good question. It says, how do I find connections at the community college or tech college who will talk to me? I'm not sure how to start advocating. Is there a disability office I should look for?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that
Yeah.
question.
Is there a disability office or something? Right. Yeah. So you've dealt with a lot of colleges, Alan.
Yeah. Yeah, every college has a disability supports office. They have different names. I would start going there. You can also go online. You can ask them what kind of supports they provide. One of the things I think it's really important for people to understand who are maybe going on to post-secondary education is how supports at a college level are very different from what they may be getting in high school, especially if they have an IEP, and their responsibility for asking for accommodations. And I think it's really important for students to understand that, and ideally to get some practice while they're still in high school, taking more control of the supports they get. We have one student, for example, who practiced while he was still in high school, although he didn't need to. His last couple semesters, he was going to teachers and asking them for the accommodations that he needed. But colleges vary quite a bit in what kind of accommodations they have. Some colleges have programs designed to provide some extra support for people with disabilities. But if you go to disability supports offices, and you'll be able to, if you just Google the college and put in disability supports, you'll find it. You'll find out what kind of support you can get in any particular place.
If people are going to be in a special education as they're 19 and 20 and maybe even 21 years old, trying out a college class is a nice thing to put on an IEP. I mean, if that's possible. We didn't have a 100% luck, but we did have some luck with schools being willing to put that on a person's schedule, that they take a community college class, just one as a tryout. And the school might even provide the transportation back and forth to the class. So the person would just be taking one, try it out class, getting used to it, getting their feet wet, and seeing how it worked. If they did do well, they would get the college credit as well as the high school credit for it.
Okay, great. Here's another IEP question. How do I get my son's teachers to start with transitional IEPs? So she's asking how to motivate.
Well, the question was, how do you get the school to start, or how do you get the family?
She asked, how do you get the teachers to start it? Or I think she means the school.
Get teachers, yeah. Yeah, well, this is kind of a national scandal. There's these indicators in the special ed law. It's not just a free appropriate education until a certain age that people are entitled to. They're entitled to transitional services, and schools that aren't providing the translation services are not complying with that part of the federal regulation. And so, I mean, I think you could start by making sure the school is kind of aware of that. And then in your state, and I know in our states there are, at the state level, there are initiatives to make schools more aware and to provide training so that they understand what they need to do as far as transition services. One of the reasons why we do the parent training and the person-centered planning is because we don't want, if we waited for the schools to get their act together, we'd be still waiting. You know what, we want the parents to say, bring very specific requests to the school. For example, as I showed you about Matt, would you pay $800 for the Manchester School of Art during the summer? It's a very specific request that we're bringing to the school, and so the school is kind of in a reactive posture. If they were proactive, that would be great. Then that would save a lot of work. But you can't wait for them to be proactive.
I think sometimes schools respond well when parents come in with some ideas for transition and for transition planning. I know there's a really good site that I like that has a lot of good information about transition IEPs for people on the autism spectrum. The name of it is OCALI, O-C-A-L-I, the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, and they have modules on transition. The ones on age-appropriate transition assessment are particularly good, but we've had some families in our project have had some luck when they've wanted the school to improve the transition plan, and they went in with some information and they gave it to the schools and they said, you know, here's some ideas for more effective or more appropriate assessment that you could do. Some other things like that.
Are there any books that you would suggest to help me?
There certainly are a lot of transition books. There's a book called Beyond High School, edited by Janice Chadsey, that I kind of like. I guess it's important to kind of be as specific as possible about what you want. There are, for example, some good books that you can just actually like search on Amazon for books. There's two of them, but I can't remember the names right now, about helping a person on the autism spectrum find a job. That are pretty good books, but that's a very specific topic.
Okay. All right, here's another one. What do you do when your child is very hard to motivate to participate?
Well, I don't know. A friend of mine one time said everybody's interested in doing what they're interested in. Nobody whose goal is to like just sit around until they die. People have some interest, and so what you have to do is hook it to whatever that small little germ of an interest it is. I've never known a person who didn't have something that they liked either to talk about or look at books about or wanted to go see or explore, and that's where you start.
This one, we have trouble motivating our 8th grade son to earn good grades and to care about how well he does. We've tried bribing with video games, etc., money. Need ideas on how to reach him and help him connect success in school with his opportunities in life.
Another friend of mine one time said, if bribery isn't working, you're just not offering enough money. But that's just a joke. That was just he was just being silly. I don't think we have to worry about people in 8th grade being children. It's fine for people in 8th grade to not be very mature. And so that's not, to me, I don't know what the exact issue is, but, obviously, people should, you can just read child rearing books about, how to get your children to behave or whatever. And just the fact that there's so many books means that there's not like an easy answer. But, I don't think it's really a transition issue so much. When somebody just doesn't want to study hard or whatever in 8th grade, you certainly aren't going to convince them. You realize your gross earnings over your lifetime will be this much more if you pay attention to this book, because that is not going to have any meaning. It's going to have to be, unfortunately. Connecting. If you could get a high school program that's decent enough, that would have enough offerings so that a person would be able to do something interesting. I can remember a person who I knew a couple of years ago that just the one thing he loved was cowboys and Indians, and so he would love to take an American history class as long as there were some cowboys and Indians in there, and that was that was how it started, with him kind of enjoying school.
Okay, well here's a good one. Have you used this program for a wider audience of students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or just for people with ASD?
No.
Yes, SPECS has been used with a wider variety of ages and developmental disabilities. There are a specific combination of parent training and planning and facilitation. Our 3-component model we've only used it with this group because that is how the funding started. You know, that's how we wound up getting the funding for it. There should be no reason why it or a similar version wouldn't work for other people with developmental disabilities, or even, for that matter, mental health issues.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything about this this program that is necessarily autism specific. I think it would work great with almost anyone.